Good evening and welcome. I'm Graham Leonard, the Victorian President of the Australian Friends of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. If you would like to become a friend, then there's application forms on your seats. I acknowledge the traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past and present. Tonight is a first and reflects the widely held concerns about what is occurring in so many areas of the world. Specifically, we are concerned about the increased violence in Israel, and in that regard we are privileged to have Professor RONNIE Friedman visiting to discuss an aspect of peace, or how peace may be achieved. Our keynote speaker is Professor Barton, and Greg will inform us about the Islamic State phenomenon. IS, as it's become known, is raising fear of Islam throughout the world and is driving the greatest threat to cultural harmony here, even in marvellous Melbourne, the multi-capital of the world. This is evidenced by, for example, the recently released report of Monash University and the Scanlon Foundation Social Cohesion Research. It finds that 25% of Australians fear Muslims, probably driven by ignorance and the media. Similarly, there is an avalanche of reports of increased anti-Semitism throughout the Western world, including Australia. Our hope is that this evening's presentations and our subsequent discussions with our presenters will lead to us all being better informed and becoming informed ambassadors in combating all forms of racism, including anti-Muslim and anti-Semitism. History teaches us that these obscenities, if they take hold, then the hatred will not end with Muslims and Jews. In addition to our presenters, I'd like to acknowledge Lady Anna Cowan, our patron and First Lady of Australia. Anna, lovely to have you along. Robert Simons, OAM, Federal President of the Friends. My fellow commissioners from the Victorian Multicultural Commission, Absalom, Shrini and Marion. Happy to have you with us. My colleagues from Transparency International, the global anti-corruption watchdog. The many leaders and representatives from our marvellous, culturally and linguistically diverse communities. It's magnificent that you could all come along tonight and add to the diverse richness of the discussions we'll have later. And I think it's a great credit to you that you're able to make time and come be with us tonight. Jennifer Huppert is here, and Jennifer's tomorrow night becomes President of the Jewish Community Council of Victoria. So mazel tov in advance, Jenny. I look forward to working with you from time to time. And your husband, Bobby. Nice to have you along, Bob. We have many friends of the Friends, our members, my Victorian team, rabbis, communal leaders, and members of Victoria's wonderful Jewish community. Professor RONNIE Friedman is Vice President for External Relations and University Advancement and is a Professor of Immunology. He is former Dean of the University's Faculty of Agriculture, Food and Environment, and a former Head of the Department of Animal Sciences and former Vice Dean for Teaching. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Agriculture and his Master's in Immunology from the Hebrew U and his Doctorate in Immunology from the Weizmann Institute of Science. He undertook postdoctoral research in immunology at Harvard Medical School and has spent time there as a research fellow and a visiting professor. He has also been a research fellow in avian immunology at the Institute of Animal Health in the United Kingdom. He has published some 100 papers, reviews and chapters in peer-reviewed journals and scientific volumes, and delivered over 200 conference and seminar papers and guest lectures in Israel and abroad. You don't look old enough, Ronnie, to have done. I invite Professor Friedman to the podium. Please give him a typical warm Melbourne welcome.
My presentation is going to be very brief here this evening. What I've been asked to talk about will actually be reflected in the first one or two slides I have to show you, and then things will tie into the main topic of this evening's lecture, or this evening's talk. Last Tuesday, on November the 18th, Moshe Trabesky was killed along with 4 other people in a massacre in a synagogue in Jerusalem. He was killed along with 4 other people in the synagogue. And what I have to say about this, and connected to the Hebrew University, is the following. There's a school at the Hebrew University called the Rothberg International School. In that school, many students, foreign students from all over the world, come to study academic studies at the Hebrew University. Amongst them, about 40 to 50 Australian students per year. Within the class, one of the classes taking place on that day, Moshe's niece participated in a spoken Arabic course. The spoken Arabic course was given within the context of Arabic studies, and the teacher was an Israeli Muslim Arab teaching that course. The people came to the course to notify the niece that her uncle had been killed, and the person that was there at the time to notify her was a teacher. After the teacher notified the niece of her husband's death, the psychologist arrived to give support. This is how things were done there. Now, half a day later, the entire class requested to participate in Moshe's funeral. The teacher also requested, due to her knowledge of the case, to participate in the funeral as well. This is Israel, this is Jerusalem, and this is the Hebrew University. This very sad case or example goes to show the pluralism of the Hebrew University, and that relates to one of the questions I have frequently being asked all over the world. What does the Hebrew University do towards to increase understanding, tolerance, and goodwill between Arabs, between Jews, between Christians? And the second thing, the most important question is, how does the Hebrew University contribute from its excellent research towards attaining this kind of common ground? So what I want to do now is to give you one simple answer to the first question and a more detailed answer to the second question, and give you some kind of idea on the role the Hebrew University has undertaken to deal with this issue. And this role is part of the university's vision of being the leading university in Israel, and obviously a center for excellence. The Hebrew University doesn't care, or doesn't really, let me put it this way. If you had asked me, put a question, how many Arab Muslim or Arab Christian students are studying in Hebrew University today, I have no idea. Just as I have no idea how many female students are studying at the Hebrew University relative to males. Because these are not questions that are asked, not in the Hebrew University, and to the best of my knowledge, not in any university in Israel. The only criterion for accepting a student at the Hebrew University is excellence in science or excellence in being a student. So if there's no telltale by knowing from the name who the student is and where the student comes from, I cannot give you that information. Frankly speaking, I don't care for it. All I care for is the excellence as students. So therefore, as a pluralistic university, everyone that meets this standard can study there. Furthermore, when you recruit teachers for the Hebrew University, the teachers themselves are not asked what label they prefer to stick to themselves when they apply for teaching jobs. The only question is whether or not they are good scientists and whether or not they can teach in Hebrew or in English. And if they can teach, and their teaching capacity is outstanding as we expect from all teachers at the Hebrew University, they will teach there. We have made tremendous efforts of creating exchange programs and teaching programs at the Hebrew University that will give some kind of preparatory preparation for students who find it difficult to be accepted at the Hebrew University. For example, we have a whole set of courses named the Mechina, or which for English I would say a preparatory course, in which students are taught and brought up to date therefore after that they can become students of the Hebrew University. And obviously recognizing the fact that many students cannot necessarily, or do not necessarily want to come to Jerusalem to study, we have been developing an international network of online courses in English to allow students worldwide to participate. An interesting fact to do with this networking is that a year or two ago, the entire Einstein archive was put online. And within a day or two, scores of millions of people worldwide entered the site in order to preserve the archives, of which 10 to 20 million were entries from China. So that probably doesn't have to surprise anyone due to the number. And the second largest group from Arabic-speaking countries throughout the Middle East. So there is a bridge here. We are contributing towards this bridge in academic tuition or teaching, and I think much more can be done, but it's not for lack of trying. The other aspect which I will speak a bit more about is providing our expertise as scientists or expertise in research, making it available for all neighboring countries. And this is done within the objective to increase an academic interaction with all our neighboring countries and obviously neighboring universities. The objectives here are four. One is to promote an exchange, academic exchange, between Arab and Israeli scientists through conferences and through meetings whenever they are, let's put it mildly, whenever they are prepared to do so, and when they're not feeling that they might be put in danger for communicating with the Hebrew University. We encourage common research projects in order to allow innovation derived from these projects, and I will give several examples in a moment, not more than three. Thirdly, the whole idea is to focus on young scientist training. We want to focus on young scientist training on both sides of the border, or three sides of the border, because they are tri-national projects too. The whole concept is to try and get young scientists to speak to each other, beginning from science, and who knows where it will progress to later on. Finally, to conduct targeted research projects for the good of the area, for the good of the entire area from which is under research, and the examples I will give in a moment will bear evidence for that. Now, this kind of scientific cooperation has gone on for years, and it really is representative of many aspects in the Hebrew University: medical sciences, natural sciences, in humanities, in the law school, etc. I have only, or had only 10 minutes this evening, so therefore I will concentrate on what I know best, and that is agriculture. I will tell you that between the years 2011 and 2015, there are over 16 funded projects that have been approved for research between Israelis, Israeli scientists and scientists from Arabic countries. The people come mainly from Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority. We have two tri-national projects, and I mention this because, as you can see, the problems that need to be resolved sometimes are common sometimes to more than one or two countries. Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and Jordan, Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and Egypt. And what are the examples? I'm going to give you three very brief examples here where cooperation is completely borne fruit, so to speak. And you'll be able to evidence from this that what cooperation can really lead to, especially in environmental projects where there are no real boundaries. A fruit fly or a bee or any other kind of insect or pest do not really adhere to fences or walls, etc. They go wherever they need to go, and they are usually taken by the wind. So we'll speak briefly about saving the bees. That was one, you did see part of that in the movie, that in the most successful part of the movie. I will speak about pest control, and finally give an idea of how water conservation, which is a very severe problem in the Middle East, in our region, is also a basis for common scientific research. Now, again, not going into this very deep, not more than one slide. The importance of bees for producing most of the food we eat. When I say most of the food, it's over 50%, it's closer to 60%. It puts this animal in sheer center here as a being of extreme importance. And if this animal is sick and it's dying out, and we require its presence not only to produce honey, which is good, but we need it also to produce, in this case, almonds, and other types of fruit stuff, something must be done if the bee is vanishing from the Middle East. So in a project that was formed between scientists from the Faculty of Agriculture, scientists from the Research Center in Volcani, which is a governmental research center, and scientists in the Palestinian Authority, groups of, there's a name for this in English which I always forget, of people who work with beehives. It's one word. I meant there, yes. They get together from all sides of the border and devise ways how to pollinate. Now, pollination is not today, in the modern agriculture, is not something you always find in the open field. Pollination is done within hothouses. How do you get bees to stay in a hothouse and not go and look for flowers outside? I mean, the flowers outside are usually more sunny, more tasty, they have more nectar, more pollen. So one needs to train the bees to remain within a hothouse, and this project has been one of the most successful projects we've had with the Palestinian Authority, very under the radar, so to speak. You will not hear this in the news. The second project, and here I apologize for the picture on the lower right of the slide, because when I usually speak of the fact that flies, fruit flies in this case, copulate to lay eggs, people don't believe it, that flies do it. So the picture on the lower left shows for certain flies do it. And they do it, and we can use this as a way for making flies think they're doing it, but actually they're not. And I will give you a very good description. What you see up here is an identical picture for demonstration, but if this is a normal male fruit fly, this one here is a sterile male fruit fly. The sterile male fruit fly is the individual that thinks he can, performs as he can, but nothing comes of it. So if farmers release sterile male fruit flies within their fields, at the time when the orchards are blossoming or etc., and the sterile male fruit flies prevent the females from laying eggs in the fruit that's beginning to grow out because there's no egg to be laying there, this is a way of taking care of a pest without using any kind of insecticide, tremendously contributing to the environment in such a form. This is a true sense of cooperation. This issue was investigated or implemented by scientists from Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority. So here you have another example of how cooperation together can control a pest, and this is one of the ideas I gave previously, that the pest does not adhere to boundaries. These fruit flies will fly anywhere and everywhere. The final and last example is the use of wastewater in drip irrigation. The Faculty of Agriculture was central in the 50s, last 50s, in developing the technology everyone knows today as drip irrigation. This technology is being used worldwide. And incidentally, this reminds me to say that all the previous examples I've given, namely saving the bees, using sterile male fruit flies, and drip irrigation are all technologies implemented and used today widely in Australia too. So this is not something that is not it's limited to Israel and our area. Now, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority may have lots of things to talk about, but there's one thing they all agree on. Well, at least one thing they all agree on. And the one thing they all agree on is they don't have enough water. And the water they have is not always of good quality. So in order to allow a population to consume the good quality water for drinking water, and to wash the cars, and other things which we can only do with very good water, water is required for irrigation, and in this case also drip irrigation. So implementing this technology throughout the region and using water that has been rescued from just flowing back into the sea gives us an opportunity of increasing our crop yield, and increasing one's crop yield increases what we call food security, namely the security that food supply will not drop due to absence of water. This also has been a project that's been investigated on 4 sides of the border, and I might say with success. Here I end my part of the evening, and I would like to thank you for listening to me, and I will go on in a moment to introducing Greg. It is a pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Greg Barton. Professor Greg Barton is Herb Faith, I hope I'm pronouncing your name precisely, Herb Faith Research Professor for the study of Indonesia, Director of the Center for Islam and the Modern World, and Director International of the Global Terrorism Research Center at Monash University. He's also UNESCO Chair in Interreligious and Intercultural Relations, Asia Pacific. For the past 20 years, Professor Barton has been active in interfaith dialogue initiatives and has a deep commitment to building understanding of Islam and Muslim society. The axis of his research interest is the way in which religious communities respond to modernity and to the modern nation state. He also has a strong general interest in comparative international politics.
Well, thank you, Shalom. Good evening. Thank you for the invitation to be here and speak with you tonight. It's an honour for me and it's a great pleasure. I'm sure you're here because this is an important topic. It's a topic of our hour, but it's an honour for me to be here on this venue and on this occasion. Hebrew University certainly is a beacon of hope. It's a light in a region that sometimes has a lot of darkness. And it's a beacon of light, and it's a cause of hope because it's a centre of learning. It's dedicated to science and to understanding, to knowledge. And the topic we're looking at tonight is like every other topic in life, but particularly acutely so, one which we have to approach with an inquiring mind to understand what's going on. Because if we react emotionally and simply respond to our worst fears, we may be justified in those anxieties, but it's not going to help us understand what's going on. So I hope tonight this presentation, which has way too many PowerPoint slides, and I will try and keep it to 40 minutes. I gave an earlier version of this talk a few weeks ago at Monash, and that was recorded and put on ABC Big Ideas. And I noticed yesterday that they had broadcast that, so I put the links here. If you look at iView or ABC Big Ideas, you can find that lecture. If you're keen to get into, for some reason, to revise the slides and look at the issues, it's a way of indicating I'm going to be moving too quickly through too many slides. But I'm happy to leave the slide set with Graham as well and make them available. I'm going to speak in 3 parts. Firstly, a background to the rise of Islamic State. Then I want to look at its own messaging. It has 9 councils. Our Prime Minister said that it's not Islamic, it's not a state, and he's correct in many respects. But it does use the language of Islam to reach out and appeal, and it targets Muslim families in recruiting. And it is functioning, sadly, as a state. It has 8 million people under its control. Most of them don't want to have it in charge. It boasts that 100,000 have sworn bayat, allegiance to it, but that leaves 8 million people, really, effectively, who don't want it there. But it is managing that territory across northern Syria and northern Iraq. And of its 9 councils, its 9 sort of ministries, one is a media council. It puts a lot of resources into messaging and media, and it does it very well. So in the second part, I'll look at how it messages its message. And it's contrary to what we might think watching the evening news. It's less about violence and jihad, executions, etc., more about what it presents as a global mission. And that's not surprising when you think about what it's trying to do. And thirdly, I want to look at how we respond to this threat. And I'm going to conclude with an opinion piece published under the name of the Emir of Dubai, the Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates, a couple of months ago. And he, I think, set out some very good ideas. Whoever helped him put together that presentation nailed some important issues. And if there's a glimmer of light in a very dark time, it's that the coalition that's come together against Islamic State is a truly international coalition, but also a regional coalition. And we are seeing Arab states stand up and take charge and be part, and that's a good thing. And so that concluding essay from the Emir of Dubai, I think is from Al Maktoum, is I think a useful way of touching upon some common themes that we should continue to hang on to in the midst of what otherwise seems very despairing news. So let me quickly move through this background. We are looking at a movement which is essentially Al-Qaeda in its latest iteration, Al-Qaeda 3.0 if you like. President Obama has said, he said recently last month on 60 Minutes that his office had underestimated ISIS. He'd said back in, I think, February this year that it was a B-grade college sports team, not a serious player. And then even in the middle of the year was saying, look, it's a problem and it's going to go away. And now it's being acknowledged this is a problem that's not going away in a hurry. It's with us for a long time. I appreciate the President's candour. You might recall when he was asked about his strategy for dealing with Islamic State in Syria, he said we don't have one yet, which of course his opponents, which he has many, were quick to jump on him, but a very, I think, sort of honest answer, because this is a tremendously difficult problem. It's been a long time building. It's come out of Al-Qaeda. It has a history that goes before Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but of course Al-Qaeda in Iraq emerged in 2004, led by this thuggish, surprisingly effective, charismatic leader from Jordan, Musab al-Zarqawi. His name speaks to his birth town. And he had a long history with Al-Qaeda. He was involved in the fight against the Soviet occupation, not very instrumentally in the 1980s, but that led him to set up a training camp. He drew a lot of foreign fighters in to that training camp in the border region between Afghanistan and Pakistan in the early 90s. And so the foundations of what we now see, not as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but as the Islamic State. It also called itself the Islamic State in Iraq, and then later the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or the Levant, if you like. Those foundations go back a long time. We're dealing with a threat that's been 3 decades in the making at least, and has elements that go back before that. Zarqawi came to Iraq ahead of the US occupation, or US-led occupation. He had a movement established. Of course, that occupation led to perfect storm conditions for insurgencies to emerge. And although Al-Qaeda didn't have a large presence there before the occupation, after the occupation, in those perfect storm conditions, Al-Qaeda and related groups became the dominant insurgent groups. And so in 2004, he officially launched Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He had a stormy relationship with bin Laden, but bin Laden found him useful if thuggish and bad for the brand image, an ongoing problem with Islamic State. Zarqawi served time in a Jordanian prison for his earlier terrorist offences. He fled the country ahead of the 9/11 attacks. He set himself up anticipating the occupation of Iraq. It seems that the Al-Qaeda leadership expected 9/11 would provoke a response in Afghanistan. 9/11 was intended to provoke a response. That's how modern terrorism works. It's deliberately offensive. It provokes a response. They expected it to provoke a response in Afghanistan. They expected us to get bogged down and fatigued, and more or less that was a fair summary. They didn't expect, it would appear, that we would go into Iraq. Zarqawi, though, saw that coming, and he made good advantage of it. And better that we didn't go into Iraq, I think, because the problems we face have to do with the way that occupation occurred, and basically, I think even now at West Point Military Academy and academies around the world, they're studying mistakes made from an occupation. It wasn't done very wisely because we didn't guard infrastructure, we didn't guard munitions, we didn't guard health and electrical installations. We allowed these insurgencies to emerge, and we allowed Al-Qaeda to get a very strong foothold. Zarqawi, who surprised us with his effective campaign, built up a very formidable network. He didn't forget his prior scores he wanted to settle with the government of Jordan. So you might recall back in 2005 there were a series of attacks in Amman, Jordan. At the time it wasn't clear why Al-Qaeda was attacking Jordan. It was Zarqawi getting his vengeance. He was a charismatic leader and I think probably a person of no small ego, and he liked to do video blogs proclaiming his successes. And a lesson that's not been lost on Islamic State today is that you do technology like that and don't do it carefully, it reveals your location. Well, they found his lat-long coordinates and set an F-16 with a 500-pound bomb, and he was taken out in 2006, and that did make a big difference. The troop surge of 2007 also made a big difference, and AQI, or Islamic State in Iraq, was effectively reined in to a considerable extent. But it's come back. It's come back with a vengeance. It announced back in June this vision of occupying most of Syria and Iraq. It's not there yet. On the Syrian side particularly, it's not anywhere near that, but it gets disturbingly closer. Of course, on June 10, it took Mosul, and in the week that followed, moved all the way down the Tigris River, and with devastating effectiveness. Not by accident. It had been planning this for a long time. Today, the territory controlled by this movement, even just with that northern third of Syria, is an area, in terms of land area, the size of Great Britain. It's an arid area, so it has a population a tenth of Great Britain. It has 8 million people under its occupation. It's mostly along the Tigris and the Euphrates and the tributaries. That is ancient Mesopotamia, of course. Apart from the land of Israel itself, in the Hebrew Bible, this is the territory that's most often referred to. This is, it's a very evocative piece of real estate to be occupying, and it's not lost on the global community. We were surprised by the rise of Islamic State. The fall of Mosul, June 10 this year, caught people by surprise. A lot of journalists were asking me and others, how come we've never heard of this group before? Where do they come from? And I would say, well, you remember there was this thing called Al-Qaeda in Iraq? They say, yeah, that's right. We didn't hear about them for some years. Well, if you looked at Time magazine back last December, their cover said Al-Qaeda's Dark Star rises. One of the few photographs we have of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. That's his nom de guerre, but it's truthful in that he was born in Baghdad, so he's an Iraqi local. And unlike Zarqawi, who was a street thug, Baghdadi has a PhD in Islamic studies, which is a bit unusual for terror groups, but it gives him some legitimacy in his claim to be Caliph Ibrahim. Anyway, this cover story detailed a campaign over several years building up to moving back into Iraq. So December, this was before it made its big surge. In January, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or Islamic State in Iraq, which was by this stage calling itself ISIS or ISIL, because it was taking in Syria as well. By January, it was surging into Anbar province. When this issue of Time magazine hit the stands, it was just on the horizon. This story actually picked up an earlier report in September by the Institute for the Study of War, and they detailed a campaign, a number of campaigns. One that was called Breaking the Walls campaign. Sounds very presumptuous or pretentious, but actually over a period from July 2012 to July 2013, Baghdadi prepared his guys in Syria. He was drawing a lot of foreign fighters into Syria to build up this force strength. He'd also started the group known as Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Nusra Front, as an independent but partner organisation. He tried to merge them, was rebuffed by al-Zawahiri, head of Al-Qaeda Corps. But he planned a campaign called Breaking the Walls, where he wanted to put together his army by breaking them out of prison and using vehicle-based IED attacks. And in July of last year, indeed, he did that. Eight jail attacks. They blew large holes in the sides of prisons around Baghdad, including Abu Ghraib, or what was Abu Ghraib, using vehicle-based IEDs. Guys rushed in, lots of suicide bombers, but then assault teams rushing in, shooting off locks dramatically with assault rifles, breaking guys out. They broke hundreds and hundreds out, probably 2,000, into the night, into the back of pickup trucks away into the desert. And what they had were most of the core leadership of Al-Qaeda in that region still alive, seasoned fighters, plus other people who had been radicalised in prison and who were now ready to fight for Baghdadi. So really formidable achievement, and fall on us for not seeing it coming. Even through 2013, they were very, very active, not just in Syria, where they'd moved their locus back in 2012, but in Iraq itself. So in 2013, they had attacks all the way down the Euphrates and the Tigris. As we saw, we were reminded of very dramatically in June, but they were there before. And back through 2013, they had a host of vehicle-based IED attacks and prison attacks. In fact, if you look at the overall timeline of how these attacks worked, since AQI was formed in 2004, through until the present. This map from the New York Times, this graph, only goes through until 2013. But there'd been a steady build-up. The last 2 years I've seen a great increase of intensity, but it's not come out of nowhere. It's been planned for. It's of course had devastating consequences on the region. A lot of people have been displaced. A lot of people have become refugees. At least 3.5 million Syrians become refugees outside their country, most of them going to neighbouring Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey, and many, many more, perhaps 8 million more, becoming internally displaced peoples inside the country. Just a horrible situation. No wonder people are moved by the horror of the human tragedy and want to do something. We need to recognise that reality. Iraq, it's not been as dramatic, but pretty bad. The reality has been that, and Baghdadi deserves credit, if that's the right word, for seeing the opportunity, drawing in foreign fighters, responding to the tragedies in Syria particularly, and using that as a drawing access to encourage people from the region and well beyond to come and fight against the Assad regime, and then later to fight against the Maliki regime in Iraq. Today we think there's probably been at least 17,000 foreign fighters going in, and that's several-fold what went into Afghanistan over a period of more than a decade. So in 3 years, 17,000, mostly from the Arab world, North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, places like Tunisia, 3,000, but a large number from Europe, from the UK, from North America, from Australia, from Southeast Asia, probably 4,000 from Western democracies. Pretty formidable. This is of course, back in the days of Afghanistan, there was no internet. Travel was very difficult. If you made your way there, you were stuck in some camp in a high altitude valley doing religious doctrine for months and months and months. You didn't see much fighting. Today, some kid from the suburbs of Australia gets on a flight and is quickly over the border from Turkey into Syria and is on the front line. He or she thinks of themselves as a hero, but they're mostly patsies. They're mostly being set up as propaganda material and ultimately, as we've been reminded with cases like Adam Dahman, who left Northcote last November, age 17, as a suicide bomber. His life ended in July in Baghdad, killing 5 people, injuring many dozens of others, and killing himself, of course. It's just an incredibly sad situation, but it's coming from a group that's not doing this accidentally, not having a streak of good luck, but is very deliberately, very carefully moving forward with a plan. So, mentioned earlier, they have a state structure. We may choose not to call them a state. We certainly don't recognise them as a state, but they're functioning as a state. They're very professional. Not only do they have experienced jihadi fighters, they have a lot of former Iraqi security force colonels and generals and other senior officers, many of them Sunnis who became disillusioned with the Maliki government. They also have lots of technocrats. They're good at what they do, and they're setting themselves up for the long haul. They control most of the Euphrates and the Tigris north of Baghdad and most of the tributaries. Of course, there's a lot of Arab region in between the two rivers, but the fertile valleys they control for the most part. They don't control the Kurdish region, as you can understand, although I think it's very likely that Erbil, capital of Turkish northeastern Iraq, would have come under formidable attack were it not for the air campaign. So the air campaign, I think, has probably come just in time from that point of view. And of course, that Kurdish presence extends over northeastern Syria. The town of Kobani is now just a little peninsula, a little island left poking out across the Turkish border under formidable attack. But the northeast of Syria remains solely under Kurdish control. This is a reminder, of course, that what's at play here is not just about terrorism, it's not just about politics, and it's not just about military strategy, it's also about social patterns. And the green area you see on this map is the Sunni majority areas of Syria and northern Iraq, and it's those areas which have had most aggrievement with the Assad regime in Damascus and the Maliki regime, the former Prime Minister's regime in Baghdad. And it's resentment over many, many years that it's allowed this group to move in and take advantage. We began to pay attention June 10. They surged down the Tigris. We had known about them in Anbar, we knew about them along the Euphrates, but June 10 they took Mosul, and within 4 or 5 days they'd got almost to the outskirts of Baghdad. They had been active since April of last year in Aleppo, which is, of course, northern Syria but west of the Euphrates, and that area is still contested by a number of groups. But they were in Ramadi as early as December of last year, right on the outskirts of Baghdad. They took Fallujah. That's a very, of course, historical name given the occupation. A lot of lives were lost, a lot of blood was spilled protecting Fallujah from insurgencies, and they took it back rather easily in January. And they took Raqqa. Raqqa is on the Euphrates, it's east of Aleppo, and it's what's effectively the capital of Islamic State. It's where, unfortunately, we've seen lots of beheadings and where we've seen those awful images of Syrian soldiers beheaded and people parading with the heads. They moved the focus to attacks along, they'd been active in the Tigris Valley earlier, but they moved intensive campaign beginning with Mosul, went up to take Tal Afar on the Turkish border. They took Tikrit, they took Mosul Dam, that was eventually taken back with air attacks, and they've been troubling the area around Baghdad. They took border towns along the Euphrates between Iraq and Syria, so they took Qaim, Abu Kamai back in June, and smaller towns, Rawa and Ana, back in late June. Of course, they declared themselves a caliphate in June 29. They changed the name from Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or Levant, to simply Islamic State. And even in the last month, they've been active around both the west and the east of Baghdad, pressing. I don't think they can take Baghdad, but they can certainly cause a lot of mischief. And they use suicide bombers as a standard tactic, so they can go right into any city that they have forces around. There's an ebb and flow in the struggle, and I think that the international campaign will ultimately be effective, but it's a very tough business, and we'll only see signs of it really being effective when they're driven out of those towns and cities along those two rivers. Well, why would anyone go and join a group that is unquestionably barbaric and murderous? What's the attraction? I think as I said, we're reminded with the story of Hebrew University that we need to seek the illumination of knowledge, we need to understand objectively what's going on, and we need to look at this group objectively and listen to the message that they're projecting. They have this media council, they have this media centre, Al Hayat, the Life Media Centre. It publishes a number of reports, most importantly Dubik, a very glossy e-magazine, which came out in early July. The fifth issue, that comes out once a month, has just come out a few days ago. Dubik is named after a town up near the Turkish border, pretty much due north of Aleppo, just 10 k's from the Turkish border. We would never have heard her were it not for the fact that, coincidentally, in a minor hadith, a minor tradition attributed to the Prophet Muhammad but not regarded as very authoritative, Dubik is mentioned as the site of effectively Armageddon, the great confrontation at the end of time. And this is a theme picked up in the first issue of Dubik magazine, that this would be the site of the final war. And because that hadith speaks of the Romans returning, they speak of Crusader armies, picking up later language from the Crusades, of course, tying it with the notion of the Romans, and saying this coalition against us is what the prophecy speaks of. It's the Crusaders coming. Of course, they've made big mileage out of the declaration of the caliphate. Initially, around the Muslim world, a lot of people rejected this and said, look, don't pay attention to these guys. This guy has no authority. But over time, that's a very powerful brand, and it's become very, very effective. It's a formidable brand to conjure with. They, of course, present themselves as the good guys battling for justice. They say the world is divided in two. The camp that is the good guys, them, and everyone else. They say that they're fighting to liberate the Sunnis in the north of Iraq and in Syria, and they put a spin on the traditional jihadi message of it being obligatory if you're a good Muslim, according to this jihadi terrorist perversion of Islam, being obligatory to engage in jihad. They say, well, it's not just jihad you have to engage in, you have to actually get behind our project. If you're not supporting the Islamic State, then you're not being a good Muslim. And so you need to recognise the leadership of Caliph Ibrahim, as he's calling himself. So this is their formula. There's no Islam except with the community, and you can't be with the community unless you leave the comforts of home and make hijrah, make this. The Prophet Muhammad was forced. His small community was forced out of Mecca to Medina. They built themselves up in Medina. They came back into Mecca at the end of the Prophet's life. That pattern of having to go away to build up a state and then come back is a very powerful motive for all Muslims. But the jihadis take this idea of hijrah and they twist it, as they do with all Islamic language, to give it a new, very modern meaning. And they say to kids in Sydney and Melbourne, if you don't leave mum and dad's house and the comforts of home and come and join the brothers, then you're not really being faithful. You've really got to join the true path. And the true path is you make the migration, you join with the Jamaat, with the community, you fight the Tawhut, the tyrants. The Middle East has plenty of tyrants, so that's a message that resonates. It's hard to defend what Assad has been doing. Who can argue that it would be good to see him go? And the Maliki government was truly sectarian and horrible. And then you swear allegiance, you have obedience, tamkin, and you support the Khilafah, the Caliphate. And so this is the new package that's being sold. Now, to the young people who are consuming this information, when they read Dabiq in English, very well written, modelled on Al-Qaeda's magazine Inspire, that was proved very effective. Anwar al-Awlaki, the American Yemeni genius behind Inspire and based with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, has been a model for them. Whether they're reading this magazine or they're consuming social media videos, it's all of a similar character. What we see is the beheading videos. What they're seeing in a closed loop, in a little bubble. They're not reading The Age or The Australian or The Herald Sun. They're not watching ABC or SBS. They're consuming just their internal media sources. And what they're consuming tells them that this is the message. This is the good fight. This is the good thing. They speak of Iraqi security force officers repenting. They speak of what's happening as being a divine judgment. They use the image of the flood. Of course, Prophet Nuh is an evocative image in Islam as well as Judaism and Christianity. They say that the problem is that throughout the world Muslims are lost in ignorance and we have to overcome it. Modern jihadi thought very much borrows on revolutionary Marxism, and so it's this false consciousness idea and consciousness raising. We have to overcome the ignorance of the people. Of course, it's a fundamentalist movement, so ending idolatry as they see it, battling shirk and idolatry. So that literally means blowing up historic mosques. So they're against Islam as practiced in Syria and Iraq, in Indonesia or India. They're against traditional Islam, the Islam that most, the 500,000 Australian Muslims follow. They're against traditional expressions of Islam. But for the young who are consuming just this material, they're being told, look, the religion of your mum and dad, of your uncle, of the imam, this is not the real thing. These guys don't get it. This is the real thing. This is hardcore. Young men are attracted to things that are hardcore. They take our words and use them. Every issue of Dabiq has a concluding section, the words of the enemy. So John McCain is presented as leader of the Crusaders, and of course there's a lot in our rhetoric which they can play. We have to be very careful in our messaging. We haven't been very good on this front. Issue number 3 is a call to hijrah. It speaks again of this being the fulfillment of prophecy. This is the site of the great battle, the Malahim, in the great land of Asham. Asham, of course, Syria, Greater Syria, Levant. It means all of Syria and Iraq, but also Lebanon and Jordan, and that northern region north of the Arabian Peninsula. And they say you're following not just in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad, they're following the footsteps of the Prophet Ibrahim. This is they take ancient language and put a modern spin on it. They say you have to get on, as it were, your camel and join the caravan. You have to leave the comforts as Abraham struggled in the desert, crossing the arid zone, setting out on the message of God. That's what you're doing. Only nowadays you can take a 767. But what makes the message very effective is that you make hijrah, but you find forgiveness. So it's the redemptive narrative, the zero to hero message. We're familiar with Muhammad Ali Barale, former King's Cross nightclub bouncer, party animal who found faith, which can be very good for a young man, but in his case he was in bad company, and then repeated that bad company on other young people, recruited dozens of young kids from Sydney and beyond. This idea, if you go and join the fight, everything's forgiven, you're a hero. This is the true path. And if you stay at home, the company around you is going to discourage you from doing the right thing. And you have to leave home. You have to go out and join the hijrah. You have to trust God. They have other publications that speak of what's happening. So the Islamic State report says what they're doing is helping the farmers, helping the poor, liberating Mosul, destroying false borders, here the Sykes-Picot line, We saw an interesting twist, though, 6 weeks ago when their spokesperson, Sheikh Al-Adani, spoke, and you might recall this being reported. This was just before Nouman Haidar went to Endeavour Hills Police Station, unfortunately, probably with an intent to attack and lose his life in the process. He was responding to a message from Adani. The last we heard from Adani was when he declared that there was now a caliphate. The Islamic State was now simply Islamic State, no longer Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and that Baghdadi was Caliph Ibrahim. So he gives this very long, rambling, shambolic, but rather strangely eloquent message, and he talks about following in the footsteps of God and defending the faithful, trusting God in battle, learning from history, seeing this whole thing as a cosmic struggle, engaging with the Crusaders. Now this coalition against Islamic State is being used as proof of the fact that they're on the right path and that God is with them. But the disturbing thing about this message was this call to fight them wherever you are, with whatever you have. So it says, "O Muwahid, believers in the oneness of God," so true believers is what it means. And it's code for saying not false Muslims, but true Muslims. Attack them wherever they are, civilian or military, uniformed or ununiformed. Just simply attack with whatever you can. And if you don't have a gun, if you don't have a bomb, take out your knife, use your car, bash their head with a rock. I mean, it seems bizarre language, but we've seen a pattern since then. And of course, this underlying message that trust in God, you're with God, God is with you, this is a divine mission. Issue 4 takes advantage of the fact that they're facing this international coalition and says, well, it's a crusade. We told you it was coming, but they will fail. In the meantime, we'll do good. What's interesting about this 4th issue is that they begin to praise Anwar al-Awlaki and they begin to praise Osama bin Laden. Now, up until this point, the leader of Al-Qaeda core, al-Zawahiri, had become impatient with Baghdadi and had declared that Al-Qaeda had nothing to do with Islamic State. Well, lately on both sides there are signs of rapprochement, and certainly on the Islamic State side, this is going back into sort of September, October, they begin to try and build bridges with Al-Qaeda core. They repeat the same message: attack when you can with what you have. Don't consult anyone, don't ask for advice, otherwise that's when security agencies become aware of what you're doing. Just go ahead and do something. Spur of the moment. And we've seen that, the sad case of Nouman Haidar in Endeavour Hills here in this city, recent cases in Ottawa and Toronto, and Ottawa and Montreal, and I can't help but wonder whether the attacks in Israel the last 2 months are not partly inspired, I'm not saying there's a direct connection, but partly inspired by this language. Anyway, issue 5, the last issue of Davik, which came out last week, the theme now is we're here and we're here to stay and we're getting steadily stronger. We're remaining and expanding. And this is a very tough message. It's very formidable to counter. We haven't really got into the social media space to counter this message. We don't really know how to take it on. For the young people consuming this stuff, this is still drawing them in large numbers. We're trying very hard to stop young Australians going, and yet they're going in large numbers. Even this last few weeks, more have gone. So they take the news and they spin it their way, as always happens with politics. So we're fighting an Anbar, we're unifying the ranks. Here, a disturbing development, they take news of other jihadi groups in the Sinai, in Libya, in Algeria, and they say, now we're coming together, and they present images here of, here it's said that people in Mosul are praying a prayer of thanks because of news that jihadi groups around the region are joining with them. They take what's happening in Kobane, or in Arabic, Islam, this small city which has become a very focal point, symbolic struggle, and they say, well, the Crusaders are being really stupid. They've come into the trap and they'll exhaust their resources here and they'll achieve nothing. They're just delaying the inevitable. We'll win there. They're very serious about having an Islamic State and making it something that's very real and very enduring. So they're picking up on a very popularist, fundamentalist idea and going back to sort of gold standard currency, using intrinsic metal values. Picking up on ancient currency, they've devised their own currency, their own coins, which they propose to circulate so that they're not part of this evil global economic system. They're picking up on messages from Yemen, talking about joining with them. Here, apparently, they would say a group of fighters in Sinai with the distinctive Islamic State flag joining with them. That's a very disturbing development for all of us, certainly for Israel. And they say Sinai is a front against the Jews, an important step towards the liberation of Beit al-Maqdis. So up until now, Islamic State's not talked a lot about Israel directly and attacking Jerusalem, but it seems that it's trying to, whether it's making this up on the run or whether this is part of a long-term plan, I think the latter is more likely given the background of activity. They're trying to build an archipelago of Islamic State elements that are supporting them. Libya, of course, they say Libya has always been faithful in this respect. Photograph here from occupied Libya. Algeria, they take the case of the execution in Algeria as evidence that the Algerians get the message. They're also joining with this cause. They try to make it broader. They take any material that we give them and they spin it their way. So they're taking here some, you can't read the text here, but there's some recent analysts from RAND at a conference, and they take what's useful to them. So they've taken the comments by some of the analysts that we're getting suckered into a long-running battle that we're going to struggle to win. And they've taken this poor chap who remains hostage but is a journalist, and so they've made him perform as a journalist, even though he's recently acknowledged that he's likely to see his life end the way his cellmates have ended their life. But he's, in this last issue, the last section is all apparently his words, certainly well-crafted English prose, saying that the West is making a great mistake, America and the UK are making a great mistake, the coalition's making a great mistake, they're being suckered into a fight that they will lose. And here in the red breakout box, they talk about events around the world, Ottawa, Montreal, also Numan Haidar's attack in Endeavour Hills. And they say this is proof of where they're going. They take this as evidence that we have walked into their trap. So the words here, they take the US analyst Michael Schwerer and said that we are far past facing terrorists, rather we're in the midst of fighting an international insurgency, and we are on the way to a world war. But the United States will have to fight at home and abroad if the foreign policy status quo is to be retained. And there is truth in what they're saying. This is propaganda, but there's truth. We're not just fighting a faraway war in Iraq and Syria, we're fighting something that comes into our suburbs and into our suburban homes and families. So how do we respond? Well, I mentioned a minute ago that the recent attacks in Israel, of course, most recently the synagogue attack, really horrible, barbaric attacks, but there's a pattern of attacks here going back through to October of using cars, using knives. I'm not saying there's a direct link with Islamic State. I don't think there's any evidence of a direct link. I think we can be quite sure that Hamas would absolutely not want Islamic State working in its territory as it sees it. On the other hand, this is a message that knows no borders. It goes out through social media. It's targeting particularly teenage boys and young men in their 20s. And it powerfully provokes imitation. And so it may well be what we're seeing is the beginning of the picking up of this theme of attacking with what you have, where you are, don't consult anyone, as a pattern for further attacks. A recent major study came out last week called the Global Terrorism Index, and I'll just make a few concluding points here before going on to Maktoum's piece. It says that we're seeing an escalating risk of terrorism. In the last year, at least 18,000 deaths, 80% of them in 5 countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria and Syria. Islamic State dominating, but also other groups like Boko Haram, which increasingly shows sign of also declaring a caliphate and linking itself with Islamic State. And the Taliban, of course, an ongoing threat in Afghanistan, which also has recently spoken out favourably about Islamic State and shown signs of joining with it. Now, it is true that my daughter says, "Should I go to the train station? It's not safe." And I say, "Look, trust me, I'm an expert. It's safe. You're more in danger of crossing the road than you are going to the train station." She said, "I could be attacked at the train station. Terrorists do that." I said, "Yeah, but you're more likely to suffer violent assault, sexual assault. Be careful, be sensible, but terrorism is a low risk." And it's true that 40 times more people are killed by homicides than terrorist attacks. But the numbers don't tell you the whole story. If you go to the beach next week, it's a nice sunny day, your risk of being involved in a car accident on the way there, or doing something, maybe having too many drinks over the barbecue lunch and then going swimming a little bit out of sorts, and drowning and getting caught in a rip. Those are much more dangerous risks than a shark attack. But every time there's news of a shark attack, it has a power of terror that goes beyond these other risks that are more important. And that's the way terrorism works. It's the shark at the beach. It's meant to make us scared and make us anxious. There's a pattern to what's happening. This report from last week maps out, of course, that the biggest problems are Syria, Iraq, but also Afghanistan, Pakistan, also Nigeria. These are the hot spots at the moment. The Horn of Africa and the Maghreb are also areas of ongoing attacks. India is a dark colour there because of other kinds of terror attacks on the eastern seaboard, mostly related to Maoist insurgencies. But Islamic State movement is increasingly drawing together the jihadi groups and giving them a unified attack. So I thought this piece that came out back on the 1st of October from Al Maktoum was worth looking at. He says, we can defeat Islamic State, ISIS, militarily. It's going to be hard, but it can be done. But ultimately, this is an intellectual battle. We're dealing with a barbaric and brutal organisation. I think it's worth noting his words here, they're carefully crafted, and it's important that an Arabic leader is saying these things. It represents neither Islam nor humanity's most basic values. Nevertheless, it's emerged, spread, and resisted those who oppose it. What we are fighting is not just a terrorist organisation, but the embodiment of a malicious ideology that must be defeated intellectually. And that's true, and that's why it's our problem here in Australia, or in Israel, or anywhere. And it's not just confined to that territory of northern Syria and northern Iraq. I consider this ideology to be the greatest danger that the world will face in the next decade. In fact, this is what Julie Bishop said at the Security Council a couple of days ago. And I think we can overplay this threat, but there's no question it's a very formidable threat. It carries the power to mobilise thousands of desperate, vindictive or angry young people and use them to strike at the foundations of civilization. The ideology fueling ISIS has much in common with Al-Qaeda and with other groups, including Nigeria, Pakistan, Afghanistan. The destruction of terrorist groups is not enough to bring about lasting peace. We must also strike at the root of their dangerous ideology and deprive them of the power to rise again. We need to deal with an environment of hopelessness and desperation. And we have to be positive. We have to have a positive response to this. We need to counter malignant ideas. We need to work with enlightened thinking, open minds, an attitude of tolerance and acceptance, very much the values of Hebrew University. And it's good to see recognition that this is the way forward. This approach arises from our Islamic religion, which calls for peace, honours life, values dignity, promotes human development, and directs us to do good to others. Now, in every religion, you have bad apples in every barrel, and there are certainly Muslims who choose to use Islamic language and that common human failing of self-righteousness to preach a malign message. But I spoke last night, invitation at a conservative Islamic group in Sunshine, and I tried to make clear that my approach to this problem academically and personally coming as a Protestant Christian is that I believe that the Abrahamic faiths have a common worldview, a common concern, that in practical day-to-day lived reality, our primary concern, I said to them, I don't know whether they'd heard this word before or not, but I said our primary immediate task in this here and now is how to become a mensch. And I explained to them that this Yiddish word means becoming the best sort of person that our Creator has made us to be. And that actually in Arabic you have insan kamil, it's a similar concept. And that if we're truly walking in the path of God, this is what we'll focus on being. Only one thing can stop a suicidal youth who's ready to die for ISIS, a stronger ideology that guides him in the right path and convinces him that God created us to improve our world, not to destroy it. And he talks about the need to work on human development. We need to address the black holes in human development that affect many areas in the Middle East. And this is sensible stuff. I mean, it's coming late in the day, but it's sensible that's being said. And finally, he says we need to inspire with hope. Our region is home to more than 200 million young people. The Middle East, of course, is a very youthful demographic. I think the average, the median age is, I think, something like 29. Places like Yemen, it's actually 19. In Australia, it's 49. So I feel more or less average in Australia, but in the Middle East, I'm an old guy for sure. We all are. It's a very youthful region. And, of course, our youth also are being reached by this message. He concludes by saying that we need to inspire hope, we need to improve lives, If we fail, we abandon them to emptiness, to unemployment and malicious ideologies of terrorism. Thomas Friedman some years ago wrote something I thought was very sensible. He said that poverty doesn't cause terrorism, but poverty of dignity is a key factor in what leads to the recruitment of young people to terrorism. He concludes by saying, I'm optimistic because I know that the people of the Middle East possess a power of hope and a desire for stability and prosperity that are stronger and more enduring than opportunistic and destructive ideas. There is no power stronger than that of hope for a better life. And that's true, but I mean, it's facing some tough headwinds at the moment, and we've got to have to be more creative, wiser in the way that we deal with this, because it's a struggle not just militarily, but at the level of ideas, and we haven't been very effective so far in our messaging. The work that Graham and others are doing in multiculturalism is really key, because the reason we haven't faced major terror attacks in Australia so far is because Muslim mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and spouses and friends have spoken up when they've had concerns about what they see happening close at hand, and good relations with police mean there have been early interventions. But that's being threatened now by something that's moving much faster, and it's below the level of the imams and the sheikhs. It's a younger demographic, and it's using technology that most of us don't use on a habitual basis. It's using social media in a very effective way. The police didn't even look at social media 5 months ago. Now they are. But it's coming in and catching us by surprise, and it's happening everywhere. And I don't know whether the recent attacks in Israel have any direct connection with Islamic State whatsoever. Because I can only think that there are young people sitting in their bedrooms or looking at their phones, consuming the same message and being inspired, even if they don't swear direct allegiance to a group. It's perhaps even outplaying Hamas in that respect. And certainly in Australia, it's constantly surprising us how young kids from good homes get swept up. In conclusion, let me just say that these ideas are important, but we're dealing with peer networks and social networks, and it's those peer networks that lead young kids astray, as they do with substance abuse, with crime, with other mistakes that young people, young men and women, particularly young men, make. It's bad company. But we need to work better to try and make society stronger so we can stop that bad company being so destructive and stop the message, stop this malign ideology. Thank you very much.
I got an email the other day, which is while everyone's getting organised and settled, which I think in many ways summarise well how our simple Western minds have great trouble understanding what we've just heard. So let me explain the Middle East and ISIS to you. It's simple, really. Australia and Israel support the Iraqi government in the fight against ISIS. We do not like ISIS, but ISIS is supported by Saudi Arabia, who we do like. We do not like Iran, but Iran supports Iraq in its fight against ISIS. We do not like Assad in Syria, and we support the fight against him, but ISIS is also fighting against him. So some of our friends support our enemies, and some of our enemies support our friends. Some enemies are now our friends, and some of our enemies are fighting against our other enemies who we want to lose, but we do not want some enemies who are fighting other enemies to win. If the people we want to defeat are defeated, they could be replaced by people we like even less. It's really quite simple.